December 8, 1941, Wake Island, Pacific Ocean. As Japanese bombers circled overhead for their second devastating raid in as many days, Construction Superintendent Dan Teeters watched his civilian workers scramble for cover among the coral rubble and half-finished bunkers. The 46 civilian contractors from Morrison Knudsen Company had been building a naval air station and submarine base when Pearl Harbor was attacked the day before. Now, they were trapped on a tiny atoll, armed with nothing but hammers and wrenches, facing one of the most experienced military forces in the world. Under international law, civilians could not fight back. If they resisted, they could be executed as guerrillas. As the Japanese bombs fell, destroying months of painstaking construction work in minutes, Teeters understood the fundamental problem facing America's war effort. You couldn't build bases in combat zones with civilian contractors. But you also couldn't win a two-ocean war without bases, airfields, ports, and supply depots stretching across tens of thousands of miles of hostile territory. Someone needed to solve this impossible equation, and solve it fast. On December 28, 1941, just 3 weeks after Pearl Harbor, Rear Admiral Ben Moriel, Chief of the Bureau of Yards and Docks, submitted an urgent request to the Secretary of the Navy. He proposed creating military construction units, men who could build anything, anywhere, under any conditions, and who could fight to defend themselves and their work. The brass was skeptical. Construction workers playing soldier, middle-aged tradesmen trying to do the work of Marines. It sounded like a disaster waiting to happen. But Moriel was insistent. On January 5, 1942, authorization came through to recruit men from the construction trades for assignment to 3 naval construction battalions. By March 5, 1942, they had their official designation, Construction Battalions, CB for short, quickly shortened to Seabees. Admiral Moriel gave them their motto himself, Construmus Batumus. We build, we fight. What Moriel created was unprecedented. He wasn't looking for young recruits fresh out of high school. He was looking for the men who had built Boulder Dam, the national highways, and New York's skyscrapers. Men who knew the difference between a transit and a theodolite, who could operate a bulldozer as naturally as driving a car, who could read blueprints in the dark and jury-rig solutions to problems that didn't exist in any manual. The Navy waived physical standards and age limits for anyone under 50. Some determined men over 60 managed to slip through. The average age of a Seabee during the war was 37, when the average age for the rest of the military was just 26. They called themselves the Old Men's Navy, though they'd punch you for suggesting they couldn't do the job. Of the 10,000 officers who eventually served in the Seabees, 85% had college degrees, mostly in engineering. The rest were graduates of what they called the University of Hard Knocks, men who'd learned their trade in the Depression-era construction industry, where mistakes cost you your job and your reputation. These were contractors, project managers, superintendents, and foremen who'd built bridges, dams, airports, and skyscrapers from coast to coast. Among the enlisted men were plumbers, carpenters, steam shovel operators, truck drivers, electricians, surveyors, welders, heavy equipment operators, and specialists in every conceivable construction trade. Many held college degrees themselves. They came from construction firms, unions, and job sites across America, bringing with them not just skills but the can-do attitude of men who'd learned to solve problems with ingenuity, muscle, and sheer determination. The first unit, designated the 1st Construction Battalion but forever known as the Bobcats, shipped out to Bora Bora in February 1942. They had exactly 277 days of existence as a unit before deploying to build a fuel depot in the South Pacific. Nobody knew if it would work. Nobody knew if these construction workers in Navy uniforms could actually function as a military unit, let alone build and fight simultaneously. But within months, Seabees were landing on Pacific Islands, with the first waves of Marines, starting construction while bullets were still flying, and completing projects that military planners had estimated would take months, if they were even possible at all. The first real test came at Guadalcanal in August 1942. The Marines had captured a partially completed Japanese airfield on the island's north coast. The strategic importance was incalculable. Whoever controlled that airfield could control the sea lanes to Australia. The Japanese knew it. The Americans knew it. The battle for that single strip of cleared jungle would determine the course of the entire Pacific War. The Seabees of the 6th Naval Construction Battalion came ashore on September 1, 1942, and found a nightmare. The Japanese had laid out the airfield in a basin. When it rained, which was constantly, the field became a swamp. When the sun came out, the surface turned to choking dust that fouled aircraft engines and turned the runway into a friable mess that crumbled under the weight of landing fighters. The runway measured 3,800 feet long and 150 feet wide. Only 1,000 feet of it was covered with mast and matting, the perforated steel planking that provided a stable surface. There were no fuel trucks, no aircraft hangars, no repair buildings, no bomb hoists. Aviation fuel had to be hand-pumped from 55-gallon drums. Bombs and ammunition had to be hand-loaded onto every aircraft. The Japanese attacked daily, like clockwork. Every day around noon, Tojo time as the men called it, 18 to 24 Japanese bombers would appear, flying in perfect V formations, escorted by Zeros. They'd bomb the airfield, crater the runway, destroy equipment, and disappear back toward Rabaul. Then the Japanese Navy would show up, at night, shelling from offshore with destroyers and cruisers, systematically destroying whatever the Seabees had rebuilt during the day. On the night of October 13th to 14th, 1942, 2 Japanese battleships, Kongo and Haruna, positioned themselves offshore and fired 9 Weighteen 14-inch shells at Henderson Field over the course of 4 hours. One Marine who survived wrote later, "You can get a dozen air raids a day, but they come and they're gone. A battleship can sit there for hour after hour and throw 14-inch shells. I will never forget those 4 hours." The next morning, when they stopped shelling, there was a haze over the whole area. 5 miles of coconut groves were gone. Where the day before you had miles and miles of coconut trees, now 5 square miles were wiped clean. Every tree was gone, the airfield was destroyed, but the airfield wasn't destroyed. By the time the Japanese planes arrived the next day to survey the damage and strafe whatever remained, fighters were taking off from Henderson Field to meet them. The Seabees had rebuilt it during the night. Commander Joseph Blunden, commanding the 6th Naval Construction Battalion, developed what he called crater crews. These were teams of Seabees with equipment and trucks already loaded with sand and gravel, positioned under cover at strategic points along the runway. Bundles of mast and matting were stockpiled along the field's edge. The moment bombs stopped falling, the crater crews would race out, fill the holes, compact the fill, and lay new matting over the repair. Blunden reported that 100 Seabees could repair a crater from a 500-pound bomb and replace the mast and mat in 40 minutes. The Japanese would bomb the field, the Seabees would repair it, the Japanese would shell it, the Seabees would repair it again. American fighters and bombers never stopped flying. Sometimes pilots would circle overhead, watching their fuel gauges drop toward empty, while the Seabees below worked frantically to fill bomb craters so they could land. The Cactus Air Force, as the ragtag collection of Marine, Navy and Army pilots at Henderson Field became known, never lost their runway for more than a couple of hours. The Japanese couldn't understand it. They'd seen the reconnaissance photos. The airfield should have been obliterated. Yet every time their planes approached Guadalcanal, American fighters rose to meet them. When a captured Japanese pilot was brought to the airfield and saw the Seabees working, he couldn't believe these were the same men who took cover during raids and then immediately went back to work. The Seabees didn't just repair Henderson Field. They extended it, widened it, and built 2 additional fighter strips nearby. They constructed 24 miles of roads connecting the port to the airfields and combat positions. They built fuel storage, ammunition magazines, hospitals and quarters for thousands of Marines. They did it while being bombed daily, shelled nightly, and occasionally fighting off Japanese ground attacks with rifles they'd barely learned to fire. The word started spreading through the Pacific Fleet. The Seabees can do anything. Nobody believed the reports coming out of Guadalcanal. A 6,000-foot runway built through jungle in 20 days, with limited equipment and while under fire. But that's exactly what the Seabees of the 3rd Construction Battalion Detachment did at Espiritu Santo in the New Hebrides in July 1942. The reconnaissance party identified the site on June 28th. The first Seabees landed on July 8th with 6 tractors, 2 scrapers, 1 grease truck, 1 petrol wagon, 3 weapons carriers and a generator. That was it. No heavy grading equipment, no pile drivers, no concrete mixers, just 6 tractors and a lot of determination. Assisted by 90 Marines, 295 infantrymen, and 50 native labourers, they worked day and night, literally around the clock. They had to clear jungle, level the ground, compact the surface, and cover it with crushed coral, all while ensuring proper drainage in an environment where it rained almost daily. The jungle fought them. The heat was crushing, regularly exceeding 100 degrees with humidity to match. Men collapsed from heat exhaustion, got up and went back to work. Tropical diseases ripped through the crews: malaria, dengue fever, dysentery, fungal infections. Every miserable tropical affliction found the Seabees, and they kept working. On July 28th, exactly 20 days after breaking ground, the 1st Fighter Squadron landed at Espiritu Santo. The next day, a squadron of B-17s touched down. The bombers immediately began striking the Japanese airfield at Guadalcanal, disrupting the construction there and buying critical time for the Allied invasion of the island. When word reached Washington, military planners initially refused to believe it. 20 days, through jungle, with minimal equipment, it was impossible. But the reconnaissance photos didn't lie. Where there had been nothing but dense tropical forest 3 weeks earlier, there was now a fully operational airfield. The Navy realised it had accidentally created something revolutionary. These weren't just construction workers in uniform. They were a force multiplier, a strategic weapon that could project American power anywhere an LST could land. The strategic implications were staggering. In the Pacific, victory would belong to whoever could build airfields faster. Airfields meant air superiority. Air superiority meant naval superiority. Naval superiority meant you could land more troops and supplies. It was a cycle, and the Seabees had just proven they could spin that cycle faster than anyone imagined possible. The Japanese had experience, training, and veteran troops, but they didn't have Seabees. In North Africa, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel was battling British forces across the desert when word reached him about American construction units that were being organised. His intelligence officers provided reports about these naval construction battalions, these Seabees. Rommel, who'd earned his reputation through rapid movement and surprise attacks, understood logistics better than most commanders. His Africa corps had been stymied repeatedly by supply problems, by the distances involved, by the difficulty of maintaining ports and airfields in combat conditions. When he read the initial reports about the Seabees, construction workers being trained as soldiers, he was dismissive. According to post-war interviews with his staff, Rommel remarked that the Americans were scraping the bottom of the barrel if they were putting old men in uniform and sending them to build bases. His logistics officers agreed. Real military engineering required army engineers, professional soldiers with years of training. The idea that civilian tradesmen could function in combat zones was laughable. But Rommel never got the chance to face the Seabees in North Africa. By the time American forces landed in Operation Torch in November 1942, Rommel's Africa Corps was already being pushed back, and the Seabees deployed to the region were working on established bases, improving ports and airfields behind the lines. The real confrontation between German military efficiency and American can-do construction would come later, in Europe, after D-Day. But it was in the Pacific where the Seabees truly proved their worth, and where the Japanese learned to fear the sight of American bulldozers as much as they feared American bombers. By early 1943, the Seabees had become legendary throughout the Pacific. MacArthur famously said the only problem he had with the Seabees was that he didn't have enough of them. Admiral Halsey, never a man given to excessive praise, stated flatly that the Seabees helped crush the Japanese in every South Pacific campaign. The pace of their work was inhuman. At Munda in New Georgia, the 24th Naval Construction Battalion built a 4,000-foot fighter strip in 20 days, working through Japanese air raids and artillery bombardment. At Rendova, Seabees built a complete artillery base in 20 hours, allowing army guns to support the invasion of New Georgia immediately. At Bougainville, Seabees landed with the Marines and had a bomber strip operational in 23 days, carved straight out of jungle and swamp that military planners had declared unsuitable for airfield construction. The Japanese kept trying to bomb the Seabee construction sites. They learned it was pointless. Bomb a Seabee project in the morning, and by afternoon it would be operational again. Shell it overnight, and by dawn they'd have repaired the damage and added new improvements you hadn't even destroyed. The Seabees developed a reputation for not just repairing damage but improving on the original design while they were at it. One Seabee commander, when asked why his airfield had better drainage than the original plans called for, reportedly said, "Well, we were repairing the bomb damage anyway, figured we might as well do it, right?" This wasn't just happening at one location, this was happening across the entire Pacific Theatre at hundreds of locations simultaneously. The scale of Seabee operations defied comprehension. In the North, Central, South, and Southwest Pacific areas, the Seabees built 111 major airstrips, 441 piers, 2,558 ammunition magazines, 700 square blocks of warehouses, hospitals to serve 70,000 patients, tanks for the storage of 100 million gallons of gasoline, and housing for 1.5 million men. They served on 4 continents and more than 300 islands, and they did it while being shot at. The Seabees weren't just building these facilities, they were fighting for them. At Guadalcanal, Seabees manned defensive positions during Japanese counterattacks. At Treasury Island, Fireman First Class Aurelio Tassone of the 87th Naval Construction Battalion became legendary for climbing onto his bulldozer during a Japanese banzai attack and driving straight at enemy positions, his blade raised as a shield, crushing Japanese soldiers who'd infiltrated the perimeter. At Saipan, Seabees landed with the Marines and immediately went to work repairing the captured Japanese airfield at Azlito. Japanese counterattacks interrupted their work repeatedly. The Seabees would drop their tools, pick up their rifles, help beat back the attack, then return to construction. 4 days after the Marines captured the airfield, it was operational for American aircraft. The captured Japanese equipment and blueprints told a story. The Japanese had estimated it would take 3 months to make Azlito operational for heavy bomber traffic. The Seabees did it in 4 days. On Guam, Seabees participated in the 3-week battle, unloading ships under fire and performing vital construction that would eventually turn the island into a major Pacific Fleet headquarters and a B-29 base for bombing Japan. On Tinian, the Seabees pulled off what became known as the Miracle of Construction. The island was captured in July 1944. Immediately, 15,000 Seabees swarmed the 39-square-mile island and began building what would become the largest airbase in the world. They built 6 runways, each 8,500 feet long and wide enough for the massive B-29 Superfortress bombers. 4 runways at Northfield, 2 at Westfield, connected by 11 miles of taxiway at Northfield alone, with hard stands for 265 planes at Northfield and 361 at Westfield. The Seabees hauled, blasted, and packed down enough coral to fill 3 times the volume of Hoover Dam. If you piled that material on flat ground, it would form a cube more than 6,700 feet tall. They moved 11 million cubic yards of earth and coral. Every runway was completed ahead of schedule. The fastest took 53 days from start to finish. Equipment ran 20 hours a day. Maintenance crews worked the remaining 4 hours repairing bulldozers, trucks, and graders damaged by the abrasive coral. The sharp coral destroyed tires and boots at an alarming rate, but the Seabees kept working. By October 1944, B-29s were launching from Tinian to bomb Japan. By 1945, Northfield and Westfield combined was larger than any airport anywhere in the world. A total of 19,000 combat missions would launch from Tinian against the Japanese home islands. When the atomic bomb components arrived aboard the USS Indianapolis on July 26, 1945, Seabees unloaded them, stored them under guard, and assisted in the assembly process. The bombs that ended the war were loaded onto B-29s at an airbase built by Seabees in record time on an island that military planners had initially dismissed as unsuitable for major air operations. The news of Seabee accomplishments filtered back to Europe through intelligence channels. German officers read the reports with disbelief. The Americans had built an entire airbase complex, the largest in the world, in less than 6 months, on a small Pacific island, while simultaneously fighting the Japanese. It had to be propaganda. No military force could construct at that pace. But then came D-Day, and German defenders in France got to witness Seabee capabilities firsthand. On June 6, 1944, the first men to hit the beaches at Normandy weren't infantry. They were naval combat demolition units, Seabees trained in underwater demolition, who'd volunteered for the most dangerous job of the invasion. Their task was to destroy the massive steel and concrete obstacles that the Germans had built in the water and on the beaches, barriers designed to tear the bottoms out of landing craft and stop any amphibious invasion. The Seabee demolition teams came under withering fire. German machine guns and artillery had the beaches pre-sighted. Men fell, but the survivors kept working, placing charges on the obstacles even as bullets snapped past and shells exploded around them. They succeeded in opening gaps in the German defences, creating corridors through which the invasion force could land. Once the beachhead was secured, regular Seabee battalions came ashore and began building the infrastructure for the invasion of Europe. They assembled pontoon causeways, allowing ships to unload directly onto the beach. They built piers, roads, and supply dumps. They operated rhino ferries, motorised pontoon barges that carried troops and vehicles from ships to shore. For the Mulberry harbours, the massive artificial ports built to supply the invasion force, Seabees provided crucial construction and assembly work. Within weeks of D-Day, Seabees had built port facilities in Normandy that rivaled established European harbours. German commanders watching from their positions inland couldn't believe what they were seeing. Every time they damaged Allied port facilities with artillery or air attacks, the Americans would repair the damage within hours. Oberst Karl Hoffmann, commanding a Wehrmacht artillery regiment near Caen, wrote in his diary in July 1944, "We shell the American docks every night. Every morning they are operational. It's as if they have an army of ghosts who rebuild everything we destroy. Today we observed construction troops working on a damaged pier while under fire from our guns. They did not even take cover. They simply continued working. This is not normal military behaviour. These Americans are insane. Hoffmann wasn't wrong to think they were insane." The Seabees had a saying, "The difficult we do immediately, the impossible takes a little longer." They meant it literally. When asked to do something that seemed impossible, their first response was always, "can do." It became their unofficial motto, and it drove German commanders to distraction. General Major Fritz Bayerlein, commanding the Panzerlehr Division, faced Seabee-built infrastructure throughout the Normandy campaign. Every road we destroy, they rebuild overnight. Every bridge we demolish, they replace with a pontoon crossing before we can exploit the gap. We're not fighting an army. We're fighting an entire American industrial machine that has learned to move at the speed of battle. By September 1944, Seabees were working throughout France, building or repairing bridges, roads, and port facilities faster than German forces could destroy them. The Wehrmacht had assumed that even if the Allies could land in France, the logistics of supplying millions of troops would eventually stall the advance. They were counting on destroyed infrastructure, demolished bridges, and cratered roads to slow the American advance to a crawl. The Seabees made that strategy worthless. Every attempt to create a logistics bottleneck by destroying infrastructure was overcome within days, sometimes within hours. When the Allies needed to cross the Rhine River in early 1945, Seabee units were assigned to facilitate the crossing. They built pontoon bridges capable of supporting tanks and heavy equipment, often under fire from German forces on the opposite bank. One Seabee battalion built a floating bridge across the Rhine in less than 48 hours, a feat that German engineers said was impossible given the river's width, current, and the ongoing combat conditions. General Lieutenant Kurt Dittmar, a highly respected German military analyst, was captured in April 1945 and interrogated by American intelligence. When asked about the Allied advance, he said the most devastating American weapon wasn't the tank or the bomber or even the atomic bomb, though he didn't know about that yet. It was the Construction Battalion. You Americans somehow put factories on ships and landed them in France. Every time we thought we'd created a delay, you built your way past it. Your construction troops worked faster than our demolition troops could destroy things. That's not warfare, that's sorcery. The only complete Seabee battalion to serve in Germany itself was the 69th Naval Construction Battalion, which arrived at Bremen on April 27, 1945. They set up camp outside the city and immediately began re-roofing damaged buildings, installing plumbing and lighting, setting up shops and offices, and installing power lines. A detachment also repaired facilities at the port of Bremerhaven. Later, a large detachment was sent to Frankfurt, designated as the headquarters for the US Navy during the occupation of Germany. German civilians and military prisoners watched in amazement as the Seabees worked. They'd spent years watching German military engineers, who were efficient and professional, but the Americans worked with a speed and casualness that seemed impossible. They made complex construction look easy, jury-rigging solutions to problems with whatever materials were at hand, improvising with an ingenuity that German engineering doctrine didn't allow for. One captured German engineer, Hauptmann Ernst Weber, was assigned to work with the Seabees during reconstruction. He later wrote, "I spent 4 years building military installations for the Wehrmacht. I thought I understood construction. Then I watched the Americans work. They built in a month what would have taken us 6 months. They used equipment we'd never seen, techniques we'd never considered. When they encountered a problem, they didn't wait for orders or consult regulations. They simply fixed it, usually in a way that worked better than the original plan. If Germany had possessed these construction battalions, we would never have lost the war. We would have built our way to victory. But we didn't have them. Only America could create such a force." The post-war assessment by German military analysts was sobering. They concluded that the Seabees represented something fundamentally different from traditional military engineering. German engineers built to spec following established procedures and regulations. They were thorough, professional, and efficient. But they were also slow by American standards, because they followed proper military protocol and waited for orders. The Seabees built to get the job done, using whatever methods worked fastest. They improvised constantly, adapted to local conditions, and made decisions on the ground without waiting for approval from headquarters. They were contractors in uniform, and they brought contractor attitudes to military construction. If something needed doing, they did it. If the plan wasn't working, they changed the plan. If they didn't have the right equipment, they modified what they had or built new equipment from scratch. The German military mind couldn't comprehend this. How could you run a military organization where individual battalion commanders had that much autonomy? How could you maintain quality control without rigid adherence to specifications? How could you coordinate complex operations without a rigid chain of command? The answer was simple. You recruited the best civilian construction talent in America, gave them military training, and then trusted them to do their jobs. The Seabees were overwhelmingly skilled tradesmen before they put on uniforms. They knew how to build things. The Navy just gave them the authority to build things in combat zones and defend their work with rifles if necessary. By war's end, nearly 325,000 men had served in the Seabees. They'd built infrastructure on 4 continents and more than 300 islands. In the Pacific alone, they'd constructed enough facilities to support a military force of millions, all while fighting a 2-ocean war. The casualty figures told the story of their dual role. More than 200 Seabees were killed in combat. Another 500 died in construction accidents. More than 2,000 received Purple Hearts for wounds received in battle. These weren't support troops staying safely behind the lines. These were men who landed with the assault forces, who worked while under fire, who fought when necessary and built whenever possible. The legend of construction mechanic third-class Marvin Shields exemplified the Seabee spirit. At the Battle of Dong Xoai in Vietnam in 1965, Shields was with Seabee Team 1104 when their camp came under heavy attack. Wounded multiple times, Shields refused evacuation and continued fighting for 14 hours, manning defensive positions and helping carry wounded to safety. When the camp commander asked for a volunteer to help destroy an enemy machine gun emplacement that was endangering everyone in the compound, Shields volunteered despite his wounds. He and the commander succeeded in destroying the emplacement with a rocket launcher, but Shields was mortally wounded during the return. He died before rescue arrived, but his actions saved the lives of many of his fellow Seabees and Green Berets. He was awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously, the first and only Seabee to receive the nation's highest military decoration. The Seabees earned 5 Navy Crosses, 33 Silver Stars, and thousands of other commendations during World War II. But their real legacy was measured in square feet of runway, tons of supplies moved, and lives saved because critical infrastructure was in place when it was needed. Every fighter pilot who landed safely at Henderson Field after a combat mission owed his life to Seabees, who'd repaired bomb craters while Japanese shells fell around them. Every B-29 that took off from Tinian to bomb Japan flew from runways built by Seabees in a record time. Every soldier who crossed the Rhine on a Seabee-built pontoon bridge was able to advance because construction troops had made the impossible possible. The post-war assessment by US military planners concluded that the Seabees had been a decisive factor in Allied victory. In the Pacific, they'd enabled the island hopping campaign by building the infrastructure needed to support each advance. In Europe, they'd prevented German demolition efforts from slowing the Allied advance. In both theatres, they'd proven that construction could be a weapon, that the ability to build faster than the enemy could destroy was a form of combat power in itself. Perhaps the ultimate tribute came from Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz, who commanded US Pacific forces throughout the war. At a ceremony in 1945, he said, "The war in the Pacific couldn't have been won without the Seabees. Every island we took, every base we built, every mile we advanced toward Japan depended on the men who could build under fire. They weren't the first to fight, but they were always the first to make victory permanent." When people ask how America won World War II, they talk about production, about factories building planes and tanks faster than the enemy could destroy them. But production only mattered if you could project that power forward, if you could build bases close enough to the enemy to bring your weapons to bear. The Seabees were the ones who projected American power forward. They were the ones who turned coral atolls into air bases, who turned beaches into ports, who turned jungle into supply depots, and they did it faster than anyone thought possible, faster than the enemy could stop them, fast enough to turn the tide of the war. German officers mocked them initially, these middle-aged construction workers playing soldier. The Japanese dismissed them as American foolishness, wasting resources on building when they should be fighting. But by 1945, no one was mocking anymore. The sight of American bulldozers hitting the beach meant that within weeks, there would be a fully functional airbase where there had been nothing but jungle or sand. It meant that supply lines would be established, that reinforcements would flow, that the American war machine would have another forward position from which to grind down Axis forces. The Seabees didn't just build bases overnight. They built the infrastructure of victory. One airfield, one pier, one road at a time, under fire, under pressure, under impossible deadlines that they met anyway because failure wasn't in their vocabulary, can do since 42. It wasn't just a motto. It was a promise, a threat to the enemy, and a reality that changed the face of modern warfare. The Germans learned too late that you couldn't stop an enemy who could build faster than you could destroy. The Japanese learned that occupying islands meant nothing if the Americans could turn any beach into a fortress in a matter of weeks. The world learned that the United States had found a way to project not just military power, but industrial power into combat zones, and that combination was unstoppable. When the war ended, the Seabees had proven that construction could be as decisive as any weapon in the American arsenal. From Wake Island, where civilian contractors had been captured because they couldn't defend themselves, to Tinian, where uniformed Seabees built the largest airbase in the world in record time, the transformation was complete. America had created a military force that enemies underestimated and allies depended on. The men who'd been mocked as old, as too civilian, as playing at being soldiers, had built the road to victory across 2 oceans and 4 continents. They'd earned their place in history not just by building, not just by fighting, but by doing both simultaneously with a skill and dedication that no other military force has ever matched. The Seabees, the construction workers in Navy uniforms, who proved that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't a gun or a bomb. Sometimes it's a bulldozer operated by someone who knows how to use it, backed by the industrial might of a nation that refused to lose. Marvin Shields' story was not isolated. At Peleliu in September 1944, Seabees of the 33rd Naval Construction Battalion landed with the Marines and immediately began building roads and airstrips, while the battle for the island raged around them. Japanese forces, entrenched in the coral ridges overlooking the landing beaches, subjected the construction sites to constant sniper fire and mortar attacks. The Seabees kept working. When Japanese counterattacks threatened to overrun their positions, they grabbed rifles and fought back, then returned to their bulldozers the moment the attack was repulsed. Chief Carpenter's mate Lawrence Meyer earned the Silver Star at Peleliu for organizing the defense of his construction site against a Japanese infiltration attempt, personally killing 3 enemy soldiers with his rifle while directing his men to defensive positions. After the Japanese withdrew, Meyer went back to supervising the construction of a fuel dump, acting as if the firefight had been nothing more than a brief interruption. The fuel dump was completed on schedule. At Iwo Jima in February 1945, perhaps the bloodiest battle in Marine Corps history, Seabees landed on D-Day +1 and found conditions that made previous Pacific operations look easy. The volcanic ash beaches had the consistency of talcum powder. Vehicles sank to their axles. Equipment bogged down within yards of leaving the landing craft. The black sand was so fine and loose that traditional construction methods were useless. The Seabees improvised. They discovered that wetting the volcanic ash with seawater created a surface firm enough for vehicles to traverse. They organised water trucks to constantly spray the beach roads, creating pathways through the impossible terrain. Under constant fire from Japanese positions in Mount Suribachi and the Northern Highlands, they built roads, unloading areas and supply points. Japanese artillery had the beaches pre-registered. Shells fell constantly. The Seabees learned to work between bombardments, to dive into foxholes when the whistle of incoming rounds began, to emerge and continue working before the dust settled. Casualties were heavy. At Iwo Jima, Seabees suffered some of their highest casualty rates of the war, but the work continued. The roads got built. The supply dumps got established. The infrastructure that allowed Marines to fight their way across the island was constructed under fire by men who refused to stop. When the famous flag was raised on Mount Suribachi on February 23, 1945, captured, in Joe Rosenthal's iconic photograph, Seabees were working on the beach below, building the roads that would allow reinforcements and supplies to reach the Marines who had taken the summit. Commander William Painter, commanding the 31st Naval Construction Battalion at Iwo Jima, wrote in his after-action report, "The volcanic ash presented construction challenges unlike anything we had encountered. Standard engineering solutions were ineffective. The men adapted, improvised, and overcame. They worked under fire that would have stopped most military units. They took casualties and kept working. When I see that photograph of the flag on Suribachi, I think of my Seabees on the beach below, building the infrastructure that made that moment possible. They don't get the glory, but they made the victory real." At Okinawa, the last major battle of the Pacific War, Seabees landed with the assault forces on April 1, 1945. The island, just 350 miles from mainland Japan, would become the staging area for the planned invasion of the Japanese home islands. The construction requirements were staggering. Multiple airfields, massive supply depots, fuel storage for an invasion fleet, ammunition magazines, hospitals, housing for hundreds of thousands of troops, and it all had to be built while fighting the most fanatical Japanese resistance of the war. The Japanese employed kamikaze attacks on an unprecedented scale at Okinawa. Suicide planes targeted American ships offshore constantly. Seabee units working on beach facilities and coastal roads were strafed by kamikazes that failed to find naval targets and chose ground targets instead. On April 6, 1945, during one of the largest kamikaze attacks of the war, a damaged Japanese Zero, trailing smoke and fire, crashed directly into a Seabee construction site near Yontan Airfield. 12 Seabees were killed instantly. Another 18 were wounded. The survivors, some badly burned, helped evacuate the wounded, then returned to work. By evening, the damaged section of the airfield was repaired and operational. The psychological toll of working under constant air attack, never knowing when a kamikaze might appear overhead, was immense. But Seabee officers reported that men kept working because stopping meant the Japanese won. Every hour of construction completed was an hour closer to ending the war. Every airfield built meant more bombers could strike Japan. Every supply dump established meant the invasion, if it came, would be better supported. The Seabees at Okinawa built Kadena Airfield into one of the largest bomber bases in the Pacific. They constructed or improved 8 additional airfields on the island. They built a fleet hospital capable of treating 4,500 patients. They constructed 70 miles of roads. They installed fuel pipelines, ammunition magazines, and warehouses covering acres of reclaimed land. All of this while the battle for Okinawa raged. All of this while kamikaze attacks continued. All of this while casualties mounted and the human cost of the war became almost unbearable. When the atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, ending the war, many of the components had been assembled at facilities built by Seabees at Tinian. The B-29s that carried the bombs took off from runways built by Seabees. The fuel they burned had been stored in tanks built by Seabees. The bombs themselves had been loaded using hoists and equipment installed by Seabees. The path to ending the war led directly through Seabee construction. After the Japanese surrender, Seabees were among the first American forces to land in Japan. They immediately began building facilities for the occupation forces, converting Japanese military installations to American use, and beginning the reconstruction of a devastated nation. Japanese civilians who'd been taught that Americans were barbarians watched in amazement as Seabees worked with the same dedication they'd shown during the war, but now building rather than destroying, helping rather than harming. Former Japanese military officers, especially engineers, were stunned by the Seabees' capabilities. They had known intellectually that American industrial production exceeded Japan's, but seeing it in action was different. Seeing construction proceed at a pace that seemed impossible, seeing equipment they'd never imagined, seeing organizational efficiency that made Japanese military construction look primitive by comparison, was a shock. One former Japanese Navy construction officer, Lieutenant Commander Takeshi Yamamoto, was interviewed by American occupation authorities in 1946. He stated, "During the war, we believed our construction battalions were the equal of any in the world. We built fortifications, airfields, and bases throughout the Pacific. Then we encountered American Seabees. Everything we thought we knew about military construction was wrong. The Americans built faster, better, and with greater efficiency than we imagined possible. At Tinian, we had estimated that the island could support perhaps one large airfield, maybe two small ones, if given a year of construction time. The Americans built 6 enormous runways in months. At Iwo Jima, we built fortifications for a year, creating what we believed was an impregnable fortress. The Americans built the infrastructure to overcome our defences in weeks, under fire. The difference was not just equipment, though their equipment was superior. The difference was their men. Your Seabees were not soldiers pretending to be builders. They were master builders who could also fight. Every man seemed to be a specialist in his trade. They made decisions without waiting for orders. They solved problems immediately. This is not how military organizations function in Japan. But it worked for America. The European theatre provided its own lessons about Seabee capabilities. In France, Belgium, and Germany, Seabees proved that their rapid construction techniques worked just as well in European conditions as in Pacific jungles. The challenges were different but no less daunting. Instead of tropical diseases and jungle terrain, they faced mud, cold, and a sophisticated enemy with years of experience in military engineering. At Cherbourg, one of the major ports captured after D-Day, German demolitions had been devastatingly effective. The port facilities were systematically destroyed, cranes were toppled, warehouses demolished, docks blown up, the harbour mined and blocked with scuttled ships. German engineers had done their work well. Military planners estimated it would take 6 months to a year to restore Cherbourg to operational status. Seabees of the 25th Naval Construction Regiment arrived in July 1944 and assessed the damage. Their commander, Captain Norman Ives, looked at the destruction and told his officers, "We've seen worse at Guadalcanal. Get to work." Within 3 weeks, the first Liberty ships were unloading at Cherbourg. Within 2 months, the port was handling more tonnage than it had before the war. The Seabees cleared the harbour of mines and scuttled vessels, rebuilt docks, repaired cranes, and jury-rigged solutions to problems that would have required months of conventional repair work. They worked around the clock, in shifts, with spotlights illuminating the work areas at night. German prisoners of war, assigned to work alongside the Seabees clearing rubble, couldn't believe the pace. Former Feldwebel Hans Möller, a Wehrmacht engineer captured at Cherbourg, later recalled, "We spent weeks carefully mining and demolishing the port. We thought we had made it unusable for at least a year. The Americans had it working again in less than a month. We would work all day clearing rubble, exhausting work. We'd return to the prisoner compound at night, certain we'd made good progress. The next morning, we'd return to find the Americans had worked through the night and accomplished more than we'd done all day. They never stopped. They had equipment running 24 hours a day. When one shift finished, another began immediately. Their foremen, most of them older men who seemed too old to be in the military, worked alongside their men and somehow kept everyone moving at an impossible pace. I asked one American, a carpenter who was at least 45 years old, how they worked so fast. He said, "Son, I've been building things since before you were born. This ain't fast. This is just how work gets done in America." At the Rhine crossings in March 1945, Seabees demonstrated that even rivers couldn't stop American logistics. The Rhine, one of Europe's great natural barriers, had been the defensive line that Germany hoped would delay the Allied advance for months. Multiple Seabee battalions were assigned to support the crossings at different points along the river. At Remagen, where American forces had captured the Ludendorff Bridge intact, Seabees immediately began building supplementary pontoon bridges nearby when the damaged Ludendorff Bridge collapsed on March 17, 1945, killing 28 American soldiers. The pontoon bridges the Seabees had already completed ensured that the Allied advance didn't stop for even a day. At Oppenheim, the 1058th Port Construction Battalion built a heavy pontoon bridge across the Rhine in 32 hours, working under sporadic German artillery fire. The bridge could support the heaviest Allied tanks and was operational before German commanders even realized Americans had crossed the river in force at that location. German military doctrine held that crossing a major river like the Rhine required extensive preparation, specialized equipment, and favorable conditions. The Americans, with their Seabees, simply built bridges wherever they needed them and kept advancing. Generaloberst Alfred Jodl, chief of the operations staff of the German Armed Forces High Command, signed the German surrender documents on May 7, 1945. In post-war interrogations, he was asked what single factor had most surprised German military planners about American capabilities. His answer: American logistics. You could build anything anywhere. We'd destroy a bridge, you'd have a new one in days. We'd crater a road, you'd have it repaired overnight. We'd demolish a port, you'd have it operational in weeks. German military planning assumed that logistics would be your weakness, that supplying armies across the distances involved would be impossible. We were wrong. You had construction battalions that could build faster than we could destroy. That shouldn't be possible in military operations, but you made it routine. The Seabees' contribution to victory wasn't just about speed, though their speed was remarkable. It was about the quality of their work. Structures built by Seabees under combat conditions often exceeded peacetime engineering standards. Runways they constructed in the Pacific were still in use decades after the war ended. Ports they rebuilt in Europe became major commercial facilities in the post-war era. The combination of skilled civilian tradesmen and military discipline created a unique capability. Seabees knew how to build things right, not just quickly. They understood that a runway that failed under heavy bomber traffic would kill pilots. They knew that a bridge that collapsed under a tank column would doom an offensive. They built to last because their reputations as tradesmen demanded it, and because men's lives depended on it. The equipment innovations Seabees developed during the war changed construction forever. Faced with problems that existing equipment couldn't solve, they modified everything. They added armor plates to bulldozers to protect operators working under fire. They adapted trucks to carry specialized equipment for rapid runway repair. They created mobile machine shops that could manufacture parts in the field when supply lines couldn't provide them. The famous Seabee bulldozer blade, angled and reinforced, was a field modification that became standard on post-war construction equipment. Seabees discovered that the standard perpendicular blade was inefficient for many tasks. They experimented with different angles and reinforcement patterns until they created a design that moved more earth with less effort. The modification was so effective that equipment manufacturers adopted it after the war. At Peleliu, Seabees faced coral so hard that standard drill bits broke almost immediately. They experimented with different alloys and heat treatments until they developed bits that could penetrate the coral without constant replacement. The technique they developed became standard in the construction industry for drilling in hard stone. The Seabee legacy extended far beyond World War II. In Korea, Seabees built the infrastructure for the United Nations forces, constructing airfields, ports, and supply depots under some of the most extreme weather conditions imaginable. In Vietnam, Seabees built bases, roads, and facilities throughout the country, often working in areas where combat operations were ongoing. The construction methods developed by Seabees during World War II influenced civilian construction for decades. The emphasis on speed, adaptability, and working with limited resources became hallmarks of American construction practices. Many of the men who served as Seabees during the war returned to the construction industry afterward, bringing military efficiency and the can-do attitude to civilian projects. The interstate highway system, built in the 1950s and 1960s, was constructed largely by companies led by former Seabees. The massive dams, bridges, and buildings that defined post-war American development were often designed and built by men who'd learned their trade-building airfields under fire in the Pacific or crossing rivers under artillery bombardment in Europe. Today, the Naval Construction Force continues the Seabee tradition. They deploy to combat zones, disaster areas, and anywhere American forces need construction support. They build in Iraq, Afghanistan, and dozens of countries around the world. The equipment is more sophisticated, the techniques more advanced, but the core mission remains unchanged. Build anything, anywhere, under any conditions. In recent decades, Seabees have responded to natural disasters, building emergency shelters after hurricanes, constructing water purification systems after earthquakes, and providing humanitarian assistance around the world. The same adaptability and resourcefulness that served them in combat serves them in disaster relief. When Hurricane Katrina devastated New Orleans in 2005, Seabees were among the first responders, building temporary housing and repairing critical infrastructure. When the earthquake struck Haiti in 2010, Seabees deployed within days, constructing field hospitals and emergency facilities. When tsunamis, typhoons, or earthquakes strike, Seabees deploy with their equipment and expertise, proving that the motto "we build, we fight" applies equally to fighting nature's destruction as to fighting military enemies. The technological sophistication has increased dramatically. Modern Seabees use satellite navigation, computer-aided design, and advanced materials that World War II Seabees couldn't have imagined. But the fundamental approach remains the same: assess the problem, develop a solution, execute immediately, and adapt as necessary. The spirit of the World War II Seabees, the men who built Henderson Field under bombardment and constructed Tinian's massive airbase in record time, lives on in every Seabee who deploys today. The final measure of the Seabees' impact on World War II came in the strategic assessments conducted after the war. Military historians analysing the Pacific Campaign concluded that without the Seabees, the island-hopping strategy would have been impossible. Each island captured required immediate construction of facilities to support the next advance. The pace of the Pacific War was determined largely by how quickly bases could be built on newly captured territory. In Europe, the assessment was equally clear. The rapid Allied advance from Normandy to the Rhine and beyond was possible because logistics kept pace with combat operations. Roads, bridges, and ports were built or repaired fast enough that supply lines never became the limiting factor they'd been in previous wars. The Seabees made this possible. The cost in lives was significant but remarkably low given the circumstances. More than 300 Seabees killed in action, several hundred more dead from accidents and disease, thousands wounded. Against the scale of World War II casualties, these numbers seem small. But each loss was a skilled tradesman, often a man with a family, who'd volunteered to put his construction expertise in service of his country. The Japanese came to fear the Seabees as much as they feared American combat forces. The sight of bulldozers coming ashore meant that within weeks their island fortress would be surrounded by American air bases. The sound of pile drivers meant a port was being built that would support an invasion fleet. Every Seabee construction project was another nail in the coffin of Japanese territorial expansion. In the ultimate irony, some of the facilities Seabees built during World War II are still in use today. Runways on Pacific Islands, expanded and improved over the decades, still serve as airports. Port facilities rebuilt by Seabees in Europe and Asia became major commercial harbours. Roads and bridges constructed under combat conditions became permanent infrastructure. The Seabees built to win a war, but they built so well that their work outlasted the conflict by generations.